Mr. Neuer.
Chairman Young, Ranking Member Merkley, thank you for inviting me to testify in the important matter of assessing the United Nations Human Rights Council ahead of the visit of Ambassador Haley to Geneva. And indeed, we will welcome her visit very much. I believe that the U.S. should remain on the Council, not because this body is upholding its mission to promote and protect human rights, but on the contrary, because the Human Rights Council is a dangerous place. And I believe for America to promote its values and the founding values of the United Nations, America should remain, it should fight, it should go on the record, it should lead its allies, it should call out abuses. And this is a body, whether we like it or not, that influences the hearts and minds of hundreds of millions of people. And we should not abandon that arena. And if possible, on those rare occasions when an alliance can be found to spotlight abusers, America should lead that effort. That's concerning values. There's also interests. America has interests to stay on the Council. It is an influential arena. There is a reason why countries around the world vie to win a seat. America has a seat, and I think it would be foolish to give up that position of influence. On human rights, the United States has to lead by what it says and what it does. That's why I criticized the President when he called certain media institutions the enemy. When he did so, I happened to be next to Can Dündar, a Turkish journalist who was called the enemy by his president, and soon after he was shot at and almost killed in Turkey. We honored him recently in Geneva. America has to lead on human rights. Of course, when we talk about the media, it is legitimate to question and criticize certain articles that appear in the media. One which I will challenge today is an article that appeared in March of this year in the New York Times by their UN correspondent, which expressed extraordinary skepticism concerning Ambassador Haley when she said that the Human Rights Council was so corrupt. And I quote from the article, she dismissed the Human Rights Council as so corrupt without offering evidence. And that skepticism remained in the article. So yes, the Human Rights Council has taken action on a number of cases. North Korea is one of them. Yes, there are many good people who work in the related Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which supports the work of the Council, and there are good special rapporteurs who are independent experts who do good work to spotlight abuses. But on so many levels, the Human Rights Council is so corrupt. And ahead of Ambassador Haley's visit, allow me to present some of that evidence. There is corruption that is financial. One gentleman, the longest-serving UN human rights expert in Geneva is a man named Ziegler, who's been there for about 17 years. You can't get rid of the guy. He was special rapporteur on hunger, and now he's on their advisory committee. He was recently celebrated by the Human Rights Council at their opening high-level session. There was a film made about his life where the head of the Human Rights Council branch, the chief of the HRC branch of the Office of the High Commissioner, went to sing his praises. Jean Ziegler is someone who was appointed by the Cubans around the year 2000. He created the Muammar Gaddafi Human Rights Prize in 1989. He went on to manage that prize from Geneva. He boasted about it in Time magazine, saying that he had $10 million from the Gaddafi government to manage this prize, which they gave to Chavez, Castro, Louis Farrakhan, and a Holocaust denier in the year 2002, in the same year that Jean Ziegler himself, as a UN expert, went to Libya and won that prize, which, by the way, came with $100,000 per year. He denied it for 10 years. When we exposed the video of him receiving the prize, he admitted it, said the Office of the High Commissioner made him give back the prize, but the money, no one has ever investigated what he did with that money. Not surprisingly, Ziegler was an ardent advocate opposing sanctions on the Gaddafi regime while he was implicated in ties with that regime. The official of the Human Rights Council who praised Ziegler recently, senior head of the HRC branch, was himself recently accused by a member of his own office of having received money from a member of the Arab League to help launch his book. There is also corruption that is ethical. When Richard Falk, who was the special rapporteur on Palestine for 6 years, someone who is a leading supporter of the 9/11 conspiracy theory, when he finally had to leave because of term limits, the day he left, his wife came in, Hillel Elver, as the new special rapporteur on hunger. She is not only his wife, but also a co-collaborator with him on his works, and has accused Israel of water apartheid. She's the expert on hunger, yet Venezuela, where people are starving, she has completely ignored. On the contrary, she has tweeted Maduro propaganda saying that the problems of starvation are caused by capitalists and people from the outside. There is corruption on the commissions of inquiry. The head of the recent Commission of Inquiry on Gaza was a man named William Shabas, who was an anti-Israel campaigner for 30 years, said that his dream defendant was Benjamin Netanyahu, and he was then made the chief of this investigation. Today we released a legal brief, which we submitted to the UN Secretary General, where we exposed the fact that one of the leading staffers on the Goldstone Commission, which is relevant because it will be cited in a new report coming out in a matter of days at the upcoming June session. A lead staffer was a woman named Gricia Bars, who she too was a senior organizer of anti-Israel legal campaigns. She was one of the professional, objective staffers who played a critical part in gathering that report. In summary, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, the Human Rights Council was founded on the promise of reform. Now, over a decade later, if we look across the board, the actions that are positive are in the small minority, and the actions that are hostile to human rights, that single out democracies like Israel, are in the majority. I believe America should stay and fight those injustices. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Neuer. Mr. Neuer, you suggest the Council's obsession with Israel best highlights the chasm between the promise versus the performance of the Council. So we have consensus here that this is unacceptable. Based on that consensus, here's the open-ended question for all of you. What specific steps can our government take, working with our international partners, to get Israel removed from the permanent agenda of the Council?
The question of the special agenda item against Israel actually dates back about 50 years. In fact, few are aware that effectively the precursor to the special agenda item against Israel began before there was even a universal agenda item for other countries. It was only after there was special attention on Israel and a couple of other countries when eventually it was expanded to be a universal agenda item separate from the one on Israel. So we're really going back to a problem that dates back at least 50 years. The architect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, René Cassin from France, walked out of the Tehran Human Rights Conference of 1968 when they began this singling out of Israel. And it really hasn't gone away. When the Human Rights Council promised it would change that, that was the promise of Kofi Annan. They specifically cited the agenda item targeting Israel that plagued the old commission. They promised that the new council would have, quote, a clean slate and would be universal in its treatment of human rights situations. And of course that was not the case. In June 2007, and I was there, they shamefully adopted once again the special agenda item against Israel. It would be extremely difficult to remove it given the current majority that exists. There is an automatic majority at the Human Rights Council of about 25 to 30 out of 47 states that will support any measure singling out Israel, and for them the agenda item is a vital part of their agenda. So I think it'll be extremely difficult. Nevertheless, the United States needs to go on the record and try its best to fight it.
I want to continue for a moment the conversation over the permanent agenda item. And I have the list of the membership here. I am wondering if the President's trip to the Middle East and the alliance of interests that exists now between a number of Sunni nations and Israel in regard to some, well, Iran specifically, may create an opening for ending agenda item 7. Do you think that that's is there an opening right now? Yes.
I think it should be tried and it should be explored. I'm skeptical. Some of the regimes, the governments that you contemplated do indeed have an on-the-ground alliance of interest with Israel. Certainly Egypt, for example, is cooperating with Israel very substantially on the ground. However, the moment you come to the United Nations arena, you get completely removed from what's happening on the ground, and sometimes you even see the opposite. You see governments that, for their own strategic reasons, may want to cooperate with Israel, but haven't yet built up legitimacy for that position among their people. And so at the United Nations, they will often do the opposite and actually aggravate their anti-Israel positions. So I'm skeptical that the opening you're seeing on the ground will translate to the United Nations, but nevertheless, I think it should be explored.
Mr. Neuer, I've got a couple of thoughts here, and perhaps you can clarify. One is we could change the calculus, as Ms. Silverberg has suggested, change the calculus of these countries by not, and encouraging them not to exhibit that bias by increasing the cost of exhibiting the bias, right? Another concern, though, is if you aggravate that relationship, which is improving, you don't allow them to publicly vent, will you undermine that improving relationship? Perhaps you could speak to that, and Ms. Silverberg, you could expand on your position.
I think the experts will have to consider on a case-by-case basis what the relationship is with each country and when it...
Let's take Saudi Arabia.
Yes. So Saudi Arabia is an example, and actually today it's not the Human Rights Council, but a lot of the things that happen at the United Nations happen across the board. Today in Geneva, the World Health Organization just met for its annual assembly, and they just voted to single out one country in the world for health conditions, and that's Israel, its treatment of Palestinians and the Druze in the Golan Heights who live exceptionally well. So the resolution was absurd. The co-sponsors included not only Syria, so the co-sponsor of the resolution, and the Palestinians, but also Saudi Arabia and other Sunni countries like Kuwait. So that's just an example today where even as President Trump flew from Saudi to Israel, and there were reports in the press that Saudi Arabia would be open to allowing overflights and other changes, improvements in their relationship with Israel, and it's been reported that there are private dealings with Israel. They clearly have no problem with going along with these things. I think it should be tried. I'm not worried that it would hurt the relationship. I think it should be tried.
Okay, so we will soon be considering here in the United States Senate whether or not to offer certain precision-guided weapons to the Saudis to carry on their fight in Yemen. This could conceivably be a precondition for that. That certainly would be leverage, one would think. Would that be a bridge too far, or something you need to reflect more on? I won't put you on the spot.
I would not want to go specific on which measures should be held as preconditions. There are many things which the United States wants the Saudis to do and to not do. Women's rights is one example. As you know, Saudi Arabia was just elected to the Women's Rights Commission of the United Nations, something that we exposed. That's also a very important matter in how they treat women. So I think across the board, these things will need to be looked at.
With respect to membership, more than half the countries on the Council are designated by Freedom House in their 2017 Freedom in the World report as either not free or partly free. I ask all of you, what can and should the United States and our international partners specifically do to keep the world's worst human rights abusers off the Council? Mr. Neuer?
Yes, I think this is a vital issue. UN Watch has, since the beginning of the Council, been leading the opposition each year to the election of dictators. We've brought the most famous human rights victims to the United Nations in New York to argue against the election of China, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and sadly, with just really a handful of exceptions, they always get reelected. So how do we fix that? I think two things need to happen. One is serious diplomatic heavy lifting by the U.S. State Department together with its allies. To date, we have not seen that, in my opinion. We saw Russia losing, so I assume that some work had happened behind the scenes, but otherwise, in the past decade, we've seen very little of it.
Why do you believe that is, very quickly? I mean, it's not as though our Congress, our government is not a friend of Israel. We are a friend of Israel. We're close allies. So why do you think that's been the case?
Well, if we look at Saudi Arabia, for example, being elected, the U.S. obviously is a close ally of Saudi Arabia. China being elected, the U.S. may fear to take on China. And you go across the board, I'll defer to those who served in government to respond. But I do want to say one thing. We could not get the United States or the European Union to say a word. Forget about what they were doing or not doing behind the scenes. But to go on the record and say that Cuba, China, Venezuela shouldn't be elected, I couldn't get them to go on the record. There was maybe really a handful of cases when Iran and Syria were running, and we exposed that. Then they made a statement. But otherwise, they've been completely silent.
I'm fascinated that there hasn't been a rule strategy to solve this. Whether the rule might be that each region must nominate twice as many countries as there are slots, so it creates something competitive. or that there has to be a certain standard in an international report to serve on the Human Rights Council? Have we attempted some strategies to change the kind of internal dynamics that you all are describing, either behind the scenes or as an actual proposed rule change?
I think the effort should be made, and I just want to note there were some exceptions to the policy of not speaking publicly in opposition to candidacies. One was Syria. When we revealed that Syria was being chosen by the Asian group, the United States did go on the record, and the European countries, and the only case that I am aware of, did go on the record, a number of them, EU countries, to oppose Syria's candidacy, and in the end.
When you say, when we exposed that Syria was being nominated, aren't the nominations public? Aren't people voting on countries that are nominated?
Things tend to be secret until the end.
I said secret until the moment of nomination.
Yes, diplomats in the Asian group told us that Syria was being selected, and they were, but it wasn't public yet.
Selected to be a nominee.
Correct.
And then, but the entire membership of the UN is voting secretly on these individuals. Well, it's, yes, Mr. Neuer?
Yeah, I think we should redouble our efforts to improve the elections. I do want to say that if that fails, which according to recent experience it will fail, then we should consider scrapping the entire election process and going to what exists in New York in the third committee where every country is a member, because the elections currently serve the dictatorships. The Saudi ambassador in Canada, when he was challenged about their human rights record, said, "What are you talking about? We were elected to the Human Rights Council." They use election to the Human Rights Council as a false badge of international legitimacy. And if the election system continues to fail, we should scrap it and let every country, which are already observers and present in Geneva, let them be members. When Gaddafi was reviewed, the New York Times actually wrote a whole article quoting the reviews, 80% of which were praise for Gaddafi. That number remains consistent for a number of countries. I often speak when the UPR reports are adopted, and I open them up and I ask one of my colleagues, count how many statements and recommendations are praise. And often the number is 80%. So it's really not a small minority, it's a lot. The praise comes from China praising Saudi Arabia for their treatment, for their actions on religious freedom, and Saudi Arabia the next day praising China for their treatment of ethnic minorities, but it's also democracies. Many democracies fail to stand up and ask concrete, specific, meaningful questions that apply scrutiny. So I think a lot of work has to be done. I'm glad that UPR exists on paper. It's good for NGOs. It's a chance once every 4 or 5 years to spotlight China or some other country. But regrettably, what happens in the room too often is then used by those regimes back home. I think the answer, the action item for democracies is to work much harder in getting our allies.
Mr. Neuer, yesterday you sent a letter to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights regarding the apparent Secretariat policy of disclosing the names of human rights activists attending Human Rights Council sessions to requesting state parties, including China, in advance of the session. Can you describe what's happened? Why would this happen? Why would this be the policy? Why you find it concerning, and perhaps what we should do about it?
Thank you. This policy, which we find outrageous, is something of direct concern to us because we bring human rights victims to speak. We brought Tiana Wang, whose father, a democracy pioneer in China, remains behind bars for his democracy work. We brought her to testify a couple of years ago at the Human Rights Council. She was intimidated by Chinese agents who were accredited NGO delegates, but were actually apparently agents of the Chinese regime. They were detained by UN security, and then one of them was expelled because of his actions to harass and photograph our human rights activist. So Chinese harassment is a real issue. Actually, Human Rights Watch yesterday had a whole press release about it in various UN fora. And when we learned from a UN whistleblower, Emma Riley, who works for the Office of the High Commissioner, she was that office's liaison to NGOs. And she said that she was instructed by the chief of the Human Rights Council branch to, quote unquote, confirm, according to the UN press release, that they confirm names to China. The Chinese gave about 12 names to the UN, said, are any of these activists coming to the upcoming session? And according to the UN press release of February of OHCHR, they confirmed that language is a dubious word because China didn't have that information. They gave names to China of activists who are coming. We find that outrageous. If that policy is still in existence. It is written nowhere on any OHCHR website for activists to know about, and it endangers the safety and security of human rights activists from China and other countries who come to speak at the Council.